Emotional vulnerability in men is often a complex and sensitive topic, as it can be perceived in different ways depending on cultural, societal, and relational factors. For many men, expressing emotional vulnerability can feel difficult or uncomfortable, due to societal expectations and pressures related to masculinity. However, when it comes to relationships, emotional vulnerability can also impact how men connect with others, including women. While vulnerability is often considered a strength in emotional intimacy, it can sometimes unintentionally push women away, especially if not communicated or understood effectively. Let's explore this in more detail. Understanding emotional vulnerability in men. Emotional vulnerability refers to the openness and willingness to express one's emotions, especially those related to pain, fear, sadness, or insecurity. Vulnerability is essential for forming deep emotional connections, but it often feels challenging, particularly for men, due to cultural and social conditioning. Cultural expectations and gender norms. 1. Traditional masculinity. In many cultures, men are raised with the belief that emotional restraint is a sign of strength, and that showing vulnerability, such as crying, expressing insecurity, or asking for help, is a sign of weakness or fragility. 1. Men are often taught to suppress their emotions and instead display traits like stoicism, control, and assertiveness. 2. Fear of judgment. Men may fear being judged or criticized for showing emotions, as vulnerability might be perceived as a failure to meet social expectations of masculinity. 2. This fear can create an internal struggle when men feel emotionally overwhelmed but hesitate to express themselves. Why emotional vulnerability can push women away. While emotional vulnerability is crucial for genuine intimacy and building trust in relationships, it's not always well received by everyone. There are several reasons why emotional vulnerability, especially in men, can sometimes unintentionally push women away. 1. Emotional overload and imbalance. 1. Intensity of emotions. Sometimes, when men become emotionally vulnerable, the intensity of their emotions can be overwhelming for their partners. 1. If a man is expressing unresolved pain, insecurity, or anger without balance, it can feel like a lot to manage for the woman, especially if these emotions are expressed all at once or too frequently. 2. Emotional burden. Women may feel like they are expected to emotionally caretake or fix their partner's emotional pain, which can create an imbalance in the relationship. 2. If emotional vulnerability is too intense or frequent, it may shift the focus from the woman's needs to the man's, potentially creating feelings of emotional fatigue or overwhelm. 2. Perception of insecurity and weakness. 1. Lack of confidence. In some cases, women may perceive emotional vulnerability as a sign of insecurity or weakness, especially if the man is consistently relying on her to provide emotional support. 1. While vulnerability itself is not weak, there can be a misconception that someone who expresses vulnerability too frequently or excessively lacks the confidence or resilience needed for a relationship. 2. Neediness. Emotional vulnerability can sometimes be perceived as neediness or dependency. 2. If a man frequently seeks validation, reassurance, or emotional support from his partner without demonstrating his own emotional strength or resilience, the woman may feel burdened by these emotional needs and push away in an attempt to regain a sense of balance and independence in the relationship. 3. Misalignment of expectations. 1. Different emotional communication styles. Men and women can often have different ways of processing and expressing emotions. 1. If a man expresses vulnerability in a way that feels too intense or dramatic, it might clash with a woman's own communication style. 1. She may not know how to respond or may feel uncomfortable if she perceives his vulnerability as excessive or overly emotional for the situation. 2. Desire for emotional stability. Many women may seek a sense of emotional stability in their partners. 2. If a man's emotional vulnerability leads to fluctuating moods or unpredictable emotional states, it can create a sense of uncertainty, making her feel as though the relationship lacks emotional security. 2. She might subconsciously feel more drawn to a partner who demonstrates more emotional balance and reliability. 4. Perceived lack of emotional reciprocity. 1. One-sided vulnerability. If a man is highly vulnerable but the woman doesn't feel that same level of emotional openness from him, she may begin to feel that the relationship lacks emotional reciprocity. 1. For instance, if he shares personal struggles but doesn't reciprocate when she needs emotional support, it may create feelings of unbalanced emotional investment. 1. Over time, this can result in her feeling less inclined to continue being emotionally available to him. 2. Emotional exhaustion, constantly receiving and supporting a partner's vulnerability without feeling equally supported can create a sense of emotional exhaustion. 2. The woman may eventually pull away or shut down emotionally to protect herself from the perceived emotional drain. 5. Fear of feeling overwhelmed. 1. Fear of inadequacy. Some women may feel a sense of pressure when faced with a partner's emotional vulnerability. 1. If the man's emotional struggles are profound, the woman may fear that she is unable to provide the support or solutions needed to help him. 1. This fear of inadequacy can create emotional distance, as she might feel overwhelmed by the weight of his emotions and the responsibility to manage them. 2. Intimacy overwhelm. Vulnerability can deepen emotional intimacy, but if it's expressed too quickly or intensely, it can feel like too much, too soon. 2. A woman may feel emotionally overwhelmed if a man opens up too deeply or too early in the relationship. 2. This can be especially true if the relationship is still in the early stages, and there hasn't been sufficient time to establish trust or emotional safety. How to navigate emotional vulnerability in relationships. While emotional vulnerability is an essential part of healthy relationships, it's important to understand how to express it in a way that promotes connection and intimacy without creating emotional strain. Here are some ways men can navigate emotional vulnerability to prevent unintentionally pushing women away. 1. Balance vulnerability with emotional strength. 1. Self-awareness. Practice being aware of your emotional needs and expressing vulnerability in a balanced way. 1. Show that you can be emotionally open without overwhelming your partner. 2. Emotional regulation. Work on regulating your emotions, especially during difficult moments. 2. Instead of immediately unloading intense feelings, take some time to process them before sharing, so that the expression is more manageable. 2. Be open, but not dependent. 1. Healthy communication. Communicate your feelings in a way that doesn't place excessive emotional pressure on your partner. 1. It's important to express vulnerability, but also show that you have healthy coping mechanisms and are not relying solely on your partner for emotional support. 3. Create emotional reciprocity. 1. Mutual sharing. Encourage a relationship dynamic where both partners feel comfortable sharing their vulnerabilities. 1. Take the time to listen and offer support when your partner opens up to you, demonstrating emotional reciprocity in the relationship. 4. Build emotional trust gradually. 1. Trust building. Vulnerability should be introduced gradually in a relationship. 1. Start with smaller disclosures and deepen the emotional connection over time as trust builds. 5. Seek professional support. 1. Therapy. If expressing vulnerability feels particularly challenging or overwhelming, seeking help from a therapist can help men develop healthier emotional expression skills. 1. Therapy can also address any deeper issues with self-worth or emotional regulation. Conclusion. Emotional vulnerability is a key ingredient for deepening emotional intimacy, but it must be navigated carefully. When men express vulnerability in a way that feels overwhelming, unbalanced, or one-sided, it can inadvertently push women away. However, when vulnerability is expressed in a healthy, balanced, and reciprocal manner, it can create a strong foundation for a lasting and emotionally fulfilling relationship. The key is to communicate openly, while also maintaining a sense of emotional balance and self-awareness. Emotional vulnerability in men. Why it can push women away. Emotional vulnerability in men. Why it can push women away.